thank you very much. I'm going to try to attach this to my lapel. That's why you wear these things. And if that doesn't work, I'll just shout. I'm just going to stick this in my pocket. Doug, thanks so much for that introduction. That's the first time anyone has introduced me and said that I was a poet. So now I'm absurdly proud of that. It needs to be higher.
Put it on the other side.
Oh yes, and that way the mic is on. Someone asked me the other day if I would help him out with the shed he was building, and I said, well, my hammer is only for left-handers, so I couldn't come out. So that's why I couldn't put the lapel thing on, right? There. So, again, thank you so much, Doug, and the title for the talk, I've tweaked it since then because I forgot what I told Doug the title was. But it's a tribute to the person who taught me about the topic, Father Bulger. And yes, indeed, Father Bulger, who was the Dean of Island History. And I was at a conference once and I met a priest. I said, do you know Father Bulger? And I said, yeah. He said, I was a chaplain in the Air Force and I was stationed in Somerset in 1964. Father Bulger came down to give a talk to the officers' mess on Confederation. He said, you know an officers' mess? It's a pretty rowdy bunch. He said he had the meeting out of the palm of his hand. Well, I'm not Father Bulger. I'm the declension from the level of expertise that he had. But I know a little bit about a lot of things because I've been involved in P.E.I. history for such a long time, which is probably why I seem to know about half the people here, because I'm old. For those of you who are not watching the Home Run Derby this evening, coming to the lecture instead, thank you. I did a little bit of tweaking of Vladdy there with the Governor General of Canada at the time of Confederation. This talk's going to be in 3 parts, and it will get faster as time goes by and people start to fall asleep or get restless. We're going to talk about the opening of Confederation as a serious ploy and the leverage applied to Prince Edward Island to try to get us to join, because, surprise, surprise, we were the birthplace of Confederation and yet stayed out, as a senator observed when I was a witness to the Senate when we had an act to make us the birthplace of Confederation. He said, I don't know how that can be. You didn't join Confederation when everybody else did. Well, I'll try to explain why that is in part 3. So here is British America in 1866. It should be 2 years earlier, but I couldn't find a map of British North America 2 years earlier. But you'll notice that the northern half of the continent is British. And colonies exist like stepping stones across the country, except for the vast expanse of much of the Canadian West, which is owned by a fur company in Britain, which is a quasi kind of governmental agency. And Prince Edward Island, in that large kind of assemblage of colonies, doesn't really rank very large. You can see our population there. We're 80,000 people in a British America that has 3.3 million people. Keep that in mind when we start to consider why we on Prince Edward Island were not enamored of the idea of a marriage with the rest of the colonies. But there's something we also need to remember, and that is the location of Prince Edward Island, and why a colony so small would become so important to Canada and to the British in terms of our being either in or outside of this union. And that is because we are strategically located in the southern part of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, athwart the shipping lanes that lead to the heart of the continent. At a time when the British and the United States, I don't know if there are any Americans in the room, okay, I won't slag off on the Americans. We love Americans. So many islanders became Americans. But America and the British were at loggerheads through most of the decade. and the United States was seen as a real threat. So could Britain or Canada afford a Prince Edward Island that was independently floating free in the Southern Gulf? Because the Colonial Office was, and I'm not going to go into great lengths of detail because Horace already took my P.E.I. history class, but there were pressures mostly from the outside in the early 1860s that were building towards a union of the colonies. Not to try to make a nation state, but a super colony, a combination of the colonies. And one of the pressures was coming from the Colonial Office in Britain, which found their colonies in North America were no longer economically needed because Britain was the colossus of the world economy. And they didn't need their colonies anymore to provide a market for their goods and a place to put people they didn't want in the British Isles. The world was their market. But colonies were expensive, and expensive to defend, especially against people like the Americans. And in the early 1860s, the United States was locked in a vicious civil war that eventually would kill 600,000 people. But they also, in the North, had created the most modern army in the Western world. And when that war was won, there was a question of whether that army would be turned on Great Britain, except they're not going to sail across the Atlantic and attack the British. They're going to attack the nearest part of the British Empire, i.e. us. So the Colonial Office cannot compel any colony to join Confederation. They gave up that right back in the 1840s when they made our government responsible governments, where we got internal autonomy in our own affairs. But they could apply a lot of pressure, and you're going to see that pressure applied through some of the slides later on. So for them, Confederation was a good thing. And they would use all the persuasion, some of it legitimate, some of it rather nasty, to try to bring it about. Now, the representative of the Crown on the island is the governor. We have a love affair with our governors and P.E.I. today. They're much respected, even if we trample their gardens. And occasionally swear at them, it would appear. The governors in the 1860s are the on-the-ground representative of the British Crown, and Dundas, after whom there's a community named of Prince Edward Island, he was given the task in the 1860s until the end of his term to try to nudge Prince Edward Island into Confederation. He failed. He was not a failure as a governor, but he failed at that. And this slide is completely out of order, but this is the Premier of Prince Edward Island in 1864, John Hamilton Gray, former British soldier, incredibly upright, very anti-American, not brilliant, but full of rectitude, who had taken office in kind of a party coup. He had seated the Premier after the Conservatives won the election of 1863. This is the person I wanted to talk about. Here's a governor who did decide to take fate in his hands. The Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick, who had an ego at least as big as the colony of New Brunswick, and he hoped as big as the Maritimes, because he had a plan to further, if not a confederation of all the colonies, a confederation, a maritime union of the colonies in our region. Now, he thought, because he was a British nobleman, that people in the Maritimes should do as they're told, and that the premiers would do as they were told, and he had hatched a plan. He said, we will have a little conference of governors and premiers to discuss maritime union. And of course, the premiers will listen to the governors, and they will go back to their assemblies, and they will pass, some kind of act bringing about a maritime union, of which he would become the lieutenant governor. Great idea. There's a long song and dance about how that evolved, but again, I won't go into it, so this is why the slides are out of order, because I wanted to show you the two John Hamilton Ways, the statue on Great George Street. I've launched a campaign for these statues to be officially named 2 Shades of Grey. And I'm hoping this is going to come back to me in a couple of years' time. I'll be on the street and there'll be a walking tour going by and the tour guide will say, this statue's called 2 Shades of Grey. I'm just saying.
We'll start that tomorrow.
Excellent. So here's what happened. The Premier of Nova Scotia said, I'm not just going to come to the conference. I think it's more important if I bring members of the ruling party and members of the opposition. Get them inside the tent rather than outside the tent. We'll co-opt them. So all of a sudden, the cozy little meeting of 6 people became a meeting involving, 4, 5 people from each column. And of course, when the conference came to Charlottetown, the governors immediately lost control of events. They didn't even play a role. They came, and they probably talked and gossiped and said, we should be telling you what to do. They really didn't get a chance. Now, on Prince Edward Island, there was so little interest in maritime union. Do you think we weren't interested in Confederation? We were as interested in maritime union as the Maple Leafs are in winning this game. Oh yeah, actually they are interested. They're just inept. Okay, bad analogy. Charlottetown was the site chosen for the Conference on Maritime Union because the rest of the delegates were afraid that if they had to travel to attend the conference, Islanders wouldn't attend. So they offered to come to Prince Edward Island, and the island, having half-heartedly approved in the legislature a motion approving the conference, said, okay, we'll host, and then did nothing about it for months. And here's the 2 principals from the Maritimes, the 2 T's, Charles Tupper and Samuel Leonard. Kelly, apparently he went by Leonard. I've been calling him Samuel in classrooms for 23 years, but apparently we should have been calling him Leonard. The Canadians intervened. The Canadians in 1864 meant those people residing in what we today would call Central Canada, Quebec and Ontario, formerly Upper Canada and Lower Canada, currently in 1864, a united province of Canada with 2 parts, Canada East and Canada West, who were locked in, quote unquote, a loveless legislative union that they were dying to get a divorce from. And again, that's a complicated story, but the governments were coalitions, and each of them had a leader from Canada East and Canada West, and it had become accepted that any major piece of legislation should have approval from both the halves of the Union, which was virtually impossible because Canada West was basically ruled over by Protestant Anglophones, and Canada East was ruled over by Roman Catholic Francophones, and they didn't see eye to eye. So you have John A. MacDonald and Georges-Etienne Cartier of Quebec, the leader of the Bleu Party, who props John A. MacDonald up in office, but John A. MacDonald is the wiliest political leader and operator, and perhaps the most amoral in some ways, in the Canadas. And I always throw in kind of a Darcy McGee because he's the most romantic and most eloquent figure among the fathers of Confederation. But the really key person here is George Brown, the leader of the Liberal or Grit Party in Canada West, who was a Francophobe and a very anti-Roman Catholic person, but he did something incredibly generous. He offered to join a coalition with John A. MacDonald, who he thought was the most unscrupulous man in North America, and Georges-Etienne Cartier to form a coalition with one plank in their platform, a union of the British North American colonies. Because for George Brown, that would break the deadlock. It would completely redraw the political landscape in British America. Now, what we don't talk about usually is that there was an or but part, which was if Confederation didn't work, they would break up the Union of Canada East and West. So in a sense, he felt he couldn't lose. Either way, he was going to get rid of those Quebecers. So there's John Hamilton Gray back in his right place. I moved him when you weren't looking. Here are the delegates from Prince Edward Island, because we didn't do anything about the conference until Canada found out there was going to be a conference in Maritime Union and said, can we attend as guests? And John Hamilton Gray said, I guess we better plan the conference then. So they set it up for September in Charlottetown, of course the best month on Prince Edward Island, the early fall. So the delegates from Prince Edward Island are John Hamilton Gray, the Premier, and the Machiavelli of the Conservative Party, William Henry Pope. Could go on at great length about William Henry Pope. He was brilliant, feared, but also his reputation was somewhat tarred. He also had a habit of playing the Protestants off against the Catholics on Prince Edward Island in order to win elections, even though he himself was an agnostic. He couldn't care less about religion unless it could win him an election. Colonial secretary. So he's in the government. Edward Palmer, who had been the premier until he was engineered out of office in 1863. I quote one of the historians of the period. Tall, gaunt, ungainly man, not given to mirth, not gifted with easy elegance, but a leader of formidable energy and ability. And he was serving in the government, even though they deposed him as premier. Oops. Yes. Did I go to? No. George Coles. All Island students know George Coles because there's a bursary named after him if you go to UPEI. Remarkably interesting person. Self-made man in a lot of respects, self-educated to some extent. He was a brewer and a distiller. Had fought a duel. We won't get into that. He was the leader of the opposition, leader of the Liberal Party, former two-term, the leader of the government. Another member of the Liberal Party at the time, MacDonald. I forgive him for spelling his name with a small d. Leader of the Liberal opposition, because of course that's incorrect. Actually, if that's how you spell your name, it's correct for your family. From Georgetown, the only father of Confederation from the island, not living in Charlottetown at the time, and the only Roman Catholic from the entire Maritimes there at the conference in Charlottetown. He's a merchant, shipbuilder, ship owner. As you know, Charlottetown was not interested in the Charlottetown Conference because the circus was in town for the first time in 2 decades, and there is an ad for the circus, Slaymaker and Nichols Circus. It was a temporary amalgamation of 2 groups. I was expecting elephants. There are no elephants, but monkeys, and apparently they were very badly behaved, and trained horses and dogs. So they were a big hit, and islanders and people from around the Maritimes flocked to Charlottetown for the circus. And oh yeah, there happened to be a conference going on at the same time. And that's one of the myths that, in the tourism industry, we love to promote certain aspects of the conference in Charlottetown, and that's one of them. There's the setting, the Province House. Soon we'll be able to go back inside the Province House, about another year apparently. But this is an illustration from the Illustrated London News from 1864, and just in case you ever get back in there, up the stairs, and you go right down to the end of the hall. And it should look something like this. Actually, it's not going to look quite like that because we're redoing it, but something like that. The Room of Destiny. It's like a Marvel Comics film. Actually, the chamber for the upper house. I like to do these talks because then I can complain about historical inaccuracies that bother me. I plan to write a column for the newspaper after I retire called "And Another Thing." William Henry Pope, the colonial secretary, did not row himself out to meet the delegates from Canada when they arrived on the first day of the conference. He actually was rowed out by someone in their oyster boat, and he was sitting in a barrel at the back. This was a painting done by Rex Woods in 1964 for Confederation Life, and unfortunately, it inspired this statue, located on the approximate site. And I was shown a maquette of the statue as an historical authority, and he had an oar in his left hand, and I said, "That's not right, that's not what happened." They said, "Well, it's too late now." They took the oar out of his hand and stuck a hat in it. And he's still sitting on the rowing bench with his back turned to the Canadians as if he had rowed out. And he appears to be asking the Canadians to save us from ourselves, which annoys me as well. That and the fact that the landscape, I don't know if you've seen this, is down by the Kika. The landscaping is like this, right alongside a bar. Why there has not been a lawsuit so far, I don't know. Someone's going to break their neck. Plus that rowboat won't float. Other than that, I love the statue. That was done for 2014. Doug, thank you for providing me with water, by the way. A couple of things we need to remember. You know, the delegates at the conference were white, European settler males. There are a lot of groups not represented at the conference who, if we were doing this again today, would have a voice, and among those voices are Indigenous Canadians who were not invited. In fact, it's not like people considered it and said, no, we won't invite them. It would not have occurred to any political leader in Canada in 1864 that they should be heard, that they had a right to be heard. But this is an illustration from the visit of, the Prince of Wales in 1860, where the Mi'kmaq did erect a teepee on the grounds of Queen Square. And when royalty came to P.E.I. for the next 60 or 80 years, they generally liked to show them the Mi'kmaq people because they were considered exotic. And of course, half of the population in British America, women, had no political rights. In fact, they had few rights. They were essentially treated in Victorian law as a chattel good of the male head of the household. Any influence they were able to exercise was behind the scenes. And it was going to take another 60 years before women on Prince Edward Island received it. So we need to remember that large parts of the population in British America are not represented in the designing of the Dominion of Canada. Here is the famous photograph, not taken at Province House, taken at Government House, one morning before the beginning of the sessions. I can't remember what morning, it may say there. I was always in love with this because Alan MacDonald was a hero of mine growing up, because I was from Newport, which is across the Cardigan River from Georgetown, and he was a MacDonald, and he had signed the deed for our house. And there he is waving at us from the photograph of the delegates. And then I realized a few years ago that he's actually shading his bald head and comb over from the early morning sun. Oh well. There was another photograph supposed to happen, but the photographer didn't show up. The conference lasted for a week. They would begin meeting in the mid-morning. They would meet until the mid-afternoon. There was a soiree every evening. There was a dinner at someone's house. There was a luncheon. Everybody likes to say that, Confederation was conceived in a haze of intoxication because the Canadians brought so much booze. No. My friend Boyd Beck used to always joke, no, it was conceived with a hangover. But the social aspect of the Charlottetown Conference was extremely important because outside of the formal meetings, this is where strangers got to know one another. This is where the rough edges of that strangeness were rubbed off. Friendships and alliances were formed. Do you think they talked about the weather during all of these parties? No. This is where a lot of the informal work of crafting a union was done. This is a modern painting by an artist from Halifax, now deceased, I believe, of the ball that ended the Charlottetown Conference. It's a little bit fanciful. Apparently, the women's dresses maybe a little finer than the island women's dresses were. You know, Robert Harris, the artist, is up there in the balcony playing a musical instrument. He was in the band that played, and later on he would paint a portrait of the Fathers of Confederation. I object, because I'm from P.E.I, to the fact that he's got all the Canadians out front doing the spotlight dance, and the Islanders are not even really visible. So, I'm annoyed by many things. What's the significance of the Charlottetown Conference? And it's something that I'm on an advisory group for the Province House exhibit. The significance of Charlottetown is this. What had been an idle debating topic or subject for after-dinner speeches, the idea of a union of the colonies, which had been thrown around for years, became in 1 week a serious political proposition. It went from an idea to agreement in principle to a confederation of the colonies if satisfactory terms could be negotiated. That's a huge if, but this is a watershed moment in the road to confederation. When something goes from an idea to a serious political sort of equation with agreement in principle. Now, the details, there were general agreement on a few important aspects of what such a union would look like, but the details were hammered out at Quebec. And yes, at one of the luncheons, I think on board the Victoria, they pronounced the banns of marriage for union, and if anybody objected, they should speak up, and nobody did. Well, if the marriage proposal was made at Charlottetown, the marriage contract was hammered out at the conference in Quebec later that fall, where we got to add a couple more people to our delegates. One of them, my favorite of all the Fathers of Confederation, even more than MacDonald, Edward Whalen, the great, tragic, romantic hero of island history. Daniel Davies. Have you ever heard of him? He didn't get to go. He's not a Father of Confederation, but he could have been. He missed his chance. Instead, we added T.H. Haviland from the muckety-muck upper crust of society on Prince Edward Island. You can tell just by how well the gloves fit. And check out those cords. Prominent leader. He never became premier, but he was the power behind the throne of a lot of governments in the 1870s. Here's the conference at Quebec. Everybody had to go outside to take a picture, of course. You couldn't take a photograph inside in the mid-1800s. And here is a photograph of the painting, the famous one done by Robert Harris in the 1880s, which was lost when the Parliament buildings burned in 1916. And you can see that the Islanders are all in the margins. And that's where they found themselves at the conference, because the terms of confederation that were hammered out at Quebec did not serve Prince Edward Island well. The wonder, in fact, is not that P.E.I. rejected confederation. The wonder is that 4 of the 7 islanders who attended the conference came home convinced confederation was a good idea in spite of these terms, because they had become infected. Maybe that's the wrong word. They had become imbued with a vision of a great nation. And most islanders were not exposed to that. So there'll be a federal union. We won't go into this because, as Horace said earlier, there's no test. Otherwise, you should pay attention. If not, i.e., the government that we have today looks a lot like the government agreed to at Quebec. 2 levels of government: a central government, federal level of government, and local governments, the provincial governments. There would be in that Parliament in Ottawa, there would be a lower house elected according to the population of the provinces, called the House of Commons. And we wouldn't have a House of Lords because we have no, well, we did have lords on P.E.I, but no actual aristocrats. There was a family called lord. A Senate with the members appointed on the recommendation of the federal government. Not elected. Alan MacDonald suggested we should elect our senators as in the United States. And everybody said, I don't think so. Look how well they're running their affairs. They're in the middle of a civil war. Bad idea. We had to back off. But appointed by region, 24 members from the Maritimes, 24 from Quebec, 24 from Ontario. But the island government wouldn't get to appoint them. Ottawa would appoint them. And so, in an elected House of Commons, we had 80,000 people in a population of about 3 million people. We'd have very few seats. Most of the power was going to be located at the federal level because, again, what was the lesson of the Civil War in the United States? The central government was too weak, not strong enough. So the government had to be strong. So it got most of the important kinds of powers, including both levels of government had the right to tax, but it got to charge tariffs on goods coming into the country, which was the main source of income. Any residual powers, anything not specifically mentioned, was assumed to reside with the federal level of government, but the provinces would control two relatively unimportant things, education and healthcare, because nobody spent any money on healthcare. Then. But the provinces wanted control over education because religion and education were a combustible mixture in the 1860s, and the provinces wanted to retain their power to determine whether there would be separate schools or not. But no one spent a lot of money on education except for the government of Prince Edward Island. And for giving up some of the taxing powers, the provinces would receive subsidies, and there were complicated formulas for that, which were lowballed, unfortunately, by some of the candidates. So, here are the delegates, and here's how they stacked up when they came home. I'll now begin having to speak up. 4 of them supported Confederation, and this is arranged from mildest to most ardent. W.H. Pope was bound and determined that we would be in Confederation. John Hamilton Gray was convinced that if we did not join, we would be swallowed up by the Americans, which for him was a fate worse than death. Anti-Confederates, Alan MacDonald said, I oppose Confederation because the members who have elected me, the people that have elected me, oppose it. And I'm bound to follow their wishes. George Cole said, if they were going to do something crazy like give us $800,000 to buy out those damned absentee landlords, maybe I would consider it. But that was not on the table, so he was against it. Edward Palmer was so anti-Confederation, he even changed parties. He is the definition of a conservative, small c and big C. He became a liberal in the 1870s because he thought the conservatives were soft on Confederation. This is serious business. I'm going to skip over this. There is another palace coup in terms of who is the premier. I want to talk a little bit about how people felt. In the region in general, there are 2 levels of opposition to Confederation. One is absolute refusal, just bad idea. And the other is, don't mind the idea, don't like the terms. In Prince Edward Island's case, the bulk of islanders belong to the 2nd level of opposition. Why? Father Bulger unjustly, I think, and almost proudly said it was because we're so parochial. I don't think so. I think islanders were pragmatic. And they saw nothing to gain and much to lose. Yes, there was a kind of inertia, and this was Prince Edward Island's golden age. This was the golden age of the island's economy. We were enjoying free trade with the United States. Our exports were booming. We were running our own affairs. We had the bit in our mouth as a colony. And if it's not broke, why fix it? We knew how much power we would lose, how much autonomy that we had just won from Britain in 1851, only 14 years ago. Okay, I can't do math. 13 years earlier. And one of the big, gets for the region was an intercolonial railway that would run from mainland Nova Scotia to Quebec. Right? We're an island. We can't get to the intercolonial railway. So we're going to be taxed to build a railway that we can't enjoy. There are all kinds of other levels and details that we can skip over. This isn't an actual quote, but it's an actual unscientific kind of poll. Various newspaper editors and political observers said 99 out of every 100 islanders is opposed to Confederation. Here's a couple of quotes. The diary of a farmer from further up the coast in Rice Point said the only people supporting Confederation were people that hoped to get a job from it. All honest men were opposed to it. So Andrew MacDonald had two other, members of the family that were in the House of Assembly by the 1870s. One of them was Archibald John MacDonald, and he wrote a memoir in 1907 where he said he was one of only 3 people in he's the only one, at one time you could only count one other in all of Kings County, and less than 100 to be found on the island supporting the Confederation. And when the vote came in the legislature, we voted overwhelmingly to stay out. In the upper house, in fact, they didn't even have a formal vote on it. So I'm saying 12-0, although I think the president of the Legislative Council probably wouldn't have voted. All right, that part of the story a lot of people know. This is a little bit more arcane. Because of the inter-party rivalry between Palmer, John Hamilton Gray, and Pope, they had to go outside the inner circle of the party for a premier, and the person they chose was the brother of W.H. Pope, J.C. Pope, who was a ship owner, originally from Quebec, of course, who had moved his operation to Summerside. And he became the premier partly because he was a stout anti-Confederate. And when the British Colonial Office said things like, "It is the strong and deliberate opinion of Her Majesty's government that it is an object much to be desired that all of North America should agree to unite in one government," except they said it much more slowly. We, in turn, took a bold stand on Prince Edward Island in the legislature in 1866. We passed a resolution not only rejecting the terms of Confederation proposed at Quebec, but basically saying, if Canada was the last person in the world, we would never consider marriage. Federal Union, they could not admit that it could ever be accomplished upon terms that would prove advantageous to the interest and well-being of the people. And this afternoon I looked up the vote on that, 21-7 in the House of Assembly, and again, 12-0, a shutout in the upper house. We would never join Confederation under any terms, except that 7 years later we did. So Confederation happens without us. 4 colonies, or 4 provinces, 3 colonies. So just to remind you, here's the stepping stones to Confederation: the Charlottetown Conference, the Quebec Conference, a conference in London where they tweaked the final terms and stuck around for the DNA Act to be passed, which went into effect on the 1st of July, 1867. Now, funny things start happening behind the scenes. James C. Pope's on a business trip to London, while the delegates from the Maritimes are in London for the London Conference. They get together, and the Nova Scotians and the New Brunswickers say, we would support an $800,000 loan to buy out the absentee landlords. And apparently, James C. Pope started to waver in his stout anti-Confederation views, except that that's electoral suicide. In fact, he didn't even run in the election of 1867, and the Conservatives took a hammering, partly on Confederation because they were divided on the issue, partly because of the suppression of the tenant. So for all intents and purposes, it looked like nothing is going to happen. Well, the Colonial Office is not well pleased with us. This is the Colonial Secretary from 1868 to 70. How did they try to pressure us to join the Confederation? Financial pressure for the most part. Exhibit A said, we're paying for your defense. You should be taking more of the burden of your own defense. So we said, okay, we will. This is like a parent talking to their child that's living in the basement. Exhibit B, when the tenant league reaches its height, and there are riots out in the countryside, and mass refusal to pay rent, a defiance of the law, and the local authorities cannot rely on the militia, and they don't have a police force, they have to call in British troops from Halifax. And the British troops are stationed here from 1865 until the end of 1866, I think into 1867, just in case, even though the tenant league melted away when they approached. And Britain said, and you're going to have to pay for those troops. The billeting, the quartering. Anyway, we finally worked out a deal where we had to build them a barracks, and we paid any time they were actually called out into the countryside. But Britain is trying to say, see, you can't afford to be independent. Exhibit C. We are trying to borrow £100,000 to buy out the absentee landlords, but no one will loan us money because we're a poor credit risk. So we go to the government in Britain and say, will you guarantee our loan, Dad? And Dad says, no. So we can't raise the money to buy out the absentee landlords. And they do it because they want to force us into Confederation, especially now since this is being dangled as a possibility from Ottawa. Then they tell us our governor is now going to have to be paid by us. I actually thought that we were paying for our governor by that time, but we weren't. In 1868, we were flirting with the Americans. Beast Butler, that was his nickname, the Beast, because of the way he treated ladies when he was the governor in New Orleans during the Civil War. A thoroughly unscrupulous man, led a trade delegation to Prince Edward Island and introduced a motion into Congress for a free trade agreement between the United States and Prince Edward Island, and we said, yes! And Britain said, no, that's not going to happen. There's no separate free trade agreements, and we didn't have the right to negotiate a treaty on our own. That's not within our power. Yes, and there was a beast on Grand Prix Wrestling in the 1970s. I don't know if some of you may remember that. Who always talked like, the Beast! 1869. So Britain and Canada are kind of frightened. Saying, this is the thin edge of American annexation. We have got to stave off the British. So Canada offers us better terms. A lot of the same terms from 1864, but they offered a guarantee of the $800,000 loan if Britain wasn't going to give us a guarantee. They would give us a guarantee. They would support any kind of act that had to be passed to seize private property, which is kind of a no-no in the Victorian era. And they promised us continuous steam communication with the mainland. And we said, you have got to be kidding. If you were the last person in the world, we would not marry Canada. And then there was a merry-go-round in the premiers. George Coles, one of the tragedies of the 1860s, George Coles suffered from increasing illness. He had a mental breakdown. He did not recover. Had to resign as premier, succeeded by someone who nobody remembers, even though I lived on the street where he had his estate, and there's a street named after him as well. He became a judge. He was only in there for a year, succeeded by Robert Ford Haythorne, a proprietor who had sold his estate to his tenants, making him a hero among the tenantry of P.E.I. and helping ensure that he would get elected. He won the election in George Coles won in 1867. He was reelected in 1870, but then his party split on whether or not the Liberals would support separate schools for Roman Catholics. And the Catholics in the caucus said yes, and the Protestants, who were a majority of the caucus, said no, and the Catholics crossed the floor and joined a coalition with the Conservative Party, who said maybe. The Conservative Party led once again by J.C. Pope. Now, J.C. Pope has a coalition of Catholic liberals and conservative Protestants and have to swear off Confederation or education until the next election because they can't agree on those two things. So they need a platform. They need, okay, what can we say that we're doing that's going to win over the electorate? And somebody had the brilliant idea that we would build a railway. A railway. The railway to the 1800s is like the computer to the late part of the 1900s, or the internet to the millennium. Nobody knew exactly how it was going to make everybody rich, but everybody was convinced that the railway was the road to the future, to prosperity. Island farmers could get their goods to seaports, to market. J.C. Pope said, we would make £100,000 a year from tourists coming to Prince Edward Island if we had a railway. And we caught railway fever, like much of North America, except in our case it killed us. So, there is the Hunslet, this is actually a prototype of the railway engine that we brought over, narrow gauge railway. They couldn't handle 6 inches of snow. In fact, the railway was supposed to open in 1874 and it had to open in May 1875 because they couldn't operate in the winter. Anyway, we started building a railway. I think we broke sod in October 1871. And by March 1872, the government had fallen on charges of corruption. Now, everybody likes to say the corruption was that the contractors were paid by the mile to build the railway, so they built the crookedest railway on Prince Edward Island so that they could maximize their income. It is a crooked railway, but that's partly because every community wanted the railway to pass through it, but also because the contractors had committed to keep the cost below a certain amount per mile. And that meant avoiding all major natural obstacles. So if you're going to cross a river, you don't cross it at the mouth of the Hillsborough River. You go to Mount Stewart, where the river is only 30, 40 feet wide. You don't go through any hills, you go around. And so it wasn't the contractors. The corruption was on the part of the government, members of which had bribed different individuals in the legislature to vote for the railway bill. And confessed to it. In fact, we're kind of proud of it. Yep, I gave them $5,000. And there was a certain tendency among members of the government to buy up certain tracts of land on Prince Edward Island, which then turned out to be on the road at the railway, and the government had to then buy it from them, who were members of, is that wrong? Well, it turns out we thought it was wrong, and the government fell, and the Haythorne government came back to power. Now, if you were the government, and you're building a railway, and you have come to power, charges of corruption, but also the realization that we cannot afford this railway. Costs are spiraling out of control. We can only finance the railway by selling our bonds on, like the money markets in London, and nobody wants to buy our bonds because we are considered a terrible credit risk. And you come to power, what do? I'm kind of thinking that you stop building the railway. Nay, nay, nay. You don't. In fact, the Liberals cannot form a government without the support of members from the eastern part of P.E.I. and the western end of P.E.I. who said, unless you commit to extending the railway to Surrey and Tignish, instead of to Alberton and the eastern end of Georgetown, we won't vote for it. So the government, even though it is unable to afford the railway it's building, immediately commits to spending more money to extend the railway still further. By December 1872, we were facing financial ruin as a government. So Haythorne is faced with a dilemma. There are basically two options. Raise taxes, or go back to Canada and go, you know how I said, you're the last person in the world. Well, Islanders don't like taxes. And in fact, governments have learned over the years that even if it's the right thing to do, sometimes electorally speaking, it's the wrong thing to do, and the Liberals were not going to raise taxes, so they went to Ottawa. And Ottawa had us over a barrel. They could have offered us any old terms they wanted. But they were desperate for Prince Edward Island to be part of Confederation. We were never more important to Canada than we were in 1873, lest we fall into the hands of the Americans. And so they improved the deal. And Haythorne was pretty pleased. His delegation had negotiated a pretty good deal. Now, oh yes, this is a graphic illustration for people that are visual learners. Physically, the P.E.I. was meant to connect Alberton with Georgetown, but in political terms, it led directly to Ottawa. As early as 1867, the island electors had forced every candidate for election to sign a pledge saying they would not vote for Confederation without the issue first going to the people in a general election. So Haythorne went to the people, and he said, oh, sorry, I'll go back. Here are the wonderful terms I've negotiated for Confederation, far better than the terms that were offered. And J.C. Pope, that's why I need to go to J.C. Pope. J.C. Pope says, John A. MacDonald and I are like that. They're conservatives, I'm a conservative, I can get a better deal, vote for me. And I just said, okay. And he actually won the election. So imagine you're Ottawa. Say, okay, we offered terms of Confederation, we improved on it, all best offers in the past, and now they come back and they go, not good enough. And you know what they did? They improved the terms yet again. And Islanders felt pretty smart. Said, ha! That's what you get for holding out. You know, instead of a shotgun wedding, we've got the whole 9 yards. And what were the whole 9 yards? Oh, here's the vote. 27-2 in the House of Assembly. And in the Legislative Council, I think they're just lazy. They didn't vote there again. It was a unanimous decision. They didn't actually have to call a division. We completely turned around our position from a decade earlier, and we joined Confederation. The other myth about Confederation is that it was all a conspiracy. That the Colonial Office and Ottawa and J.C. Pope had put the fix in. His concept of building a railway, which Islanders sucked like sack, was in fact a ploy to get us to begin building a railway we could not afford because it would force us into Confederation. And that rumor is spreading as early as 1874. I'm reading this in accounts of P.E.I. There's one problem with that conspiracy theory. Can you imagine if this was today? The internet would just blow up.
Yeah.
There's one problem with the theory. No one has found any evidence. The only evidence we've found is that the governor of P.E.I. is writing to the Colonial Office saying, I'm so pleased they're going to build a railway because they can't afford it and it will lead them into Confederation. So he made a prediction, but we don't know if he engineered a railway. By the way, yes, double crossing. We had the best terms offered, and this, by the way, we end. The best terms offered any province at that point to join Confederation. 6 members in the House of Commons. We'd only been offered 5, or actually we only deserved to have 5 according to our population. And we had always said, we need 6 members because there are 3 counties and 2 doesn't divide into 5. Or 3 doesn't divide into 5, sorry. Not a really strong constitutional argument for 6 seats, but we got 6 seats. We got the loan, and we've never paid it back. But it's been like credit card, debt. They keep subtracting the interest from our annual grant. We were promised continuous steam communication with the mainland, which ultimately would lead to the fixed link after decades of agitation and complaint. Ottawa agreed to absorb our public debt, which by this time was sizable. It was not a big problem in 1864. It was a ruinous problem in 1873. And they took over the cost of completing the railway and operating it, which is lucky for us because, as far as I know, the railway never turned a profit in its entire history. And we would receive subsidies, and they improved the subsidies that we were offered. We got $30,000 a year to pay the expenses of having a government. Pretty good. Up from 25,000. Of course, I think the cost of government's gone up, not sure. Per capita subsidy of 80 cents per head of population. Subject to the revision. We never thought of what would happen if our population went down, because their subsidy should have gone down and our population did start to drop, but they didn't. That turned out to be a floor, not a ceiling. We got a debt allowance, which is it's a complicated sort of equation about, we gave you a debt allowance, what's your actual debt, the difference, you get the difference in interest. And so we were able to kid ourselves that by holding out, we had gotten the best deal so far. Canada had courted us. This is the proclamation, which I can't read even when I blow it up. And here is, I apologize for the quality of the picture. I took a photograph of this on the wall in the store someplace, so there's a lot of reflection. Those are not aliens attending the proclamation. The newspapers are split. Some of the papers said it was completely ignored. The guy came out on the balcony, read the proclamation, and there was a stray dog and a couple of people. Yeah. Other newspapers said there was a sprinkling, a respectable crowd. The historical artist here is gilding the lily a little bit about the ceremony. Here we are, now part of the Dominion of Canada, number 7 with a bullet. And in the summer of 1873, Governor General of Canada came to visit the newest acquisition. And we put up a big arch saying, long court won at last. And he wrote back to his boss that I would seem to be quite under the impression that it's the Dominion that had been the next Prince of Rhode Island. I thought it best to play out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. Are you willing to take...
I will entertain questions. I might even answer some of them. There's a lot to this story. I mean, Father Bolger, in fact, I brought along his book. Well, I can find it. A whole book just on the subject of P.E.I. and Confederation, a landmark book published in 1964. So there's a lot more, but I'm happy to entertain it. George, you did say you were going to ask questions.
Is it true that one of the things that P.E.I. didn't want to join Confederation because we didn't have crown lands here on the island?
We wanted compensation for the lack of crown land, and that was because we had not set aside much in the way of land. Lot 66 was set aside as crown land in 1767, and then it was granted even later. So Prince of Rhode Island wanted compensation for the fact it didn't have crown land. I'm not sure if it was part of the debate about a factor against it. It was certainly going to be a crippling problem after the fact, because Ontario and Quebec and the rest of the country had crown land that the governments could use to create income for itself. And we didn't have that opportunity to use crown land to grant it or find different kinds of resources on it. But I don't know if that was a big factor, the fact that we didn't have crown land, except that we thought we should get something for the fact that we didn't have crown. Now, we were planning to buy back 400,000 acres of land from the absentee landlords, but we were committed to then selling that to the tenants that actually lived on it, so it wasn't going to be crown land for very long.
Did Newfoundland have an invite to the Shawland Conference? If not, why not?
My recollection is that they were informed of the conference too late for them to attend, so they went to Quebec, and they sent a delegation to Quebec. And in 1869, the government, one of the delegates was, the premier, and he became pro-Confederation, and he ran on the platform of Newfoundland becoming a part of the Dominion of Canada in 1869, and was badly defeated. And the issue didn't come up again until the 1890s, when Newfoundland had a financial crisis and their banks all went bankrupt. Then they thought about Confederation again. But of course, as you know, they didn't join until
They
1949.
must have had better luck with their railway, did they?
No. In fact, the railway was one of the things that bankrupted them in the 1930s. One of the things for Newfoundland is most of the people in Newfoundland lived on the northeastern and the eastern side of Newfoundland. So even though it is technically very close to the continent, their eyes were turned to Britain in the 1860s. They didn't have much trade or connection to Canada at all, and they had a trade to Prince Edward Island and other parts of the Maritimes, but really that was a minor part of their consciousness and identity. So it was a bigger stretch for them to think of themselves as part of a continent. And Newfoundlanders are proud and independent, of course, as Islanders were. But I often say, if P.E.I. had stayed out, because nothing is inevitable in history, right? How would they have fared? Lacking a resource base. Newfoundland has a different kind of a resource base, but equally limited, and I think its struggles would have been a parallel to the struggles we would have faced. But they stayed out.
Ed, thank you, of course. George Brown, and I, wondering if I heard, I don't know whether I heard it in vignettes and whether it was artificial or, for theatrical purposes, but his journey through to that coalition, like he had left the country and came back, I'm just wondering if, in the people not officially represented, whether his wife did in fact play a big part. It was kind of like, George, stop complaining about what's going on in Canada, either shut up about it or go back and do something about it?
I think you've touched on two important points, that women do have an influence, even if they politically don't have a voice. And in George Brown's case, his wife was influential. The other thing is that George Brown was changed as a person because he fell in love. It softened him, and her influence made him a better person. This is kind of a trite, cliche thing to say. So that stiff-necked, discriminatory attitude became more constructive, and I think a lot of credit should be given to his wife. And of course, he wrote letters to her in which he gave an account at the conference, and it's one of the only sources of information about Charlottetown are from those letters. So also valuable in another sense. So yeah, it's kind of a good point about the role of that kind of individual woman, but also the potential role of women. Sorry, yes?
Canada wanted Prince Edward Island in because of the threat to from the Americans. How seriously did the Americans actually, did they even court Prince Edward Island?
Ben Butler was hoping to get momentum for a campaign for the presidency. So he delivered his report to Congress, and Congress basically ignored it. I think 2 people spoke to his report. So he said, free trade, but the island is a great idea. And Congress went, yeah, okay, what's for lunch? The United States mackerel industry, and this is a more complicated story, but the mackerel industry in the Gulf was a major industry in the United States, especially in New England. And there are 600, different kinds of mackerel ships that come into the Gulf every year. After Canada was formed, the government of Canada took a rather stricter attitude towards enforcing 3-mile limits. And mackerel don't respect any kind of boundary, and they're often found inshore. Where P.E.I. did not have a strict attitude towards that. So the Americans shifted the base of operations for the mackerel industry in the Gulf to P.E.I. for a brief window of time when we were out of Confederation. And of course, the free trade agreement had been accompanied by an act of Parliament, or an act of the legislature in P.E.I., which allowed Americans to come here and own land and to transship their fish. So instead of having to sail all the way up into the Gulf from Gloucester, fill your vessel with fish, sail all the way back to New England. Now you just had to go to Charlottetown, unload your catch onto the steamer that ran to Boston and go back out to fish. So PEI had set up kind of a friendly arrangement with the Americans for the fishery. And so certain aspects of American interests were keen on PEI and the potential acquisition of it. But in general, the United States didn't show a whole lot.
It was just commercial interest in that.
Yeah, if they could get their fish and get that arrangement some other way, they didn't have to acquire us. But there was, America had its eyes on the West, and it thought the West was more important than this small island. Because although there's saber rattling and there's the Trent Affair in 1862 and nearly went to war, I think it was always highly unlikely that, you know, they were going to invade us. And if they weren't going to attack people. The same problem with, you know, the Fenian scare, which was a forcing confederation over in New Brunswick, because that's on the border of Maine, and the Fenians, these Irish American rebels, could invade from Maine into New Brunswick, but they weren't going to come to PEI. That's another story.
If the circus hadn't been in Charlottetown in 1864, would there have been more public interest in the issue?
Yes. Now, mind you, the press did cover it, but the popular mood was more fixed on the circus. You know, monkeys in the circus, not the monkeys in Providence. That's kind of a slur of the politician. Yes.
I guess I'm wondering, what holdouts from this do you see in modern day attitudes of islanders towards the federal government?
Towards Confederation. Well, we quickly came to feel neglected. It's like once Canada had acquired us, they lost interest in us. And so need and the poverty of our government and their people turned us into people coming to Ottawa with their hand out. And it became an entrenched attitude in Ottawa that Islanders were always looking for something. And not, you know, begging, saying, it's our right, we deserve this because of, and they had various different kinds of reasons. So there's a love-hate relationship with Ottawa because it was the hand that fed as well as the hand that you bit. After the birth of federal transfer payments in the 50s and 60s, I think Islanders' attitude towards Ottawa improved because Ottawa became a major source of funding for a lot of the things that improved the quality of life. So the one big holdover was, of course, continuous steam communication with the mainland, which was not provided until 1917, and it's the basis for our demand for a fixed lane. So that was a term that we felt was not fulfilled until 1997. Now, sort of, except for the Fairwood Islands.
What were our main exports from the island at that time?
I would have said spuds, but it's not. The major exports tend to be fish and especially grain, also hay to feed livestock. So not manufacturing goods, raw resources.
Not building boats?
We're a major ship builder, that's true, a major export is building ships, and it's no surprise that 1864 through 66 are the peak years for the shipbuilding industry in PEI. We're building, what, Doug, something like 129, 130 vessels a year on average through those 3 years. And that's the magic elixir that turns our red ink to black in the merchant, you know, ledger books. And this is an export industry that brings in new money. But those ships are not being sold in the United States, of course. They're being sold mostly in Britain, especially in places like, Wales and Liverpool and London. Those are the big three places that you can correct me on that. Doug knows more about the shipbuilding industry than I do because he's interested in wood. But yeah, that's a major export as well. And the shipbuilding industry is in decline, but not earmarked for disaster in 1873. It collapses in 1878, 79. And I mean collapses, like falls off a cliff. And Doug has done a great job of explaining some of the reasons why that happened in the way that it did. And I would recommend his work on the subject, for sure. That's most of what I know. Any other questions? Maybe we can take one more question.
Yeah.
one more question.
Well, listen, thank you for being here tonight. I was telling people at the beginning, a few people came in, I said, I gave a talk once in Alberton, 3 people came. The organizer, the person doing the introductions, and her son, who was 9, who she couldn't even hold on. And they apologized. And they apologized by saying, you know, there's a big wake up. You were beaten up by a dead person. To see such a big crowd warmed my heart. Thank you.